In this video, we'll have a look at solver choice for simulating mid to large scale scenes. We'll have a look at what solver's best to create this waterfall look, and we'll create a classic splash tank and compare all three solvers to see what different looks they produce. In this scene, we're going to simulate a mid-scale splash tank, and if we just hit play, you can see we've got this keyframed bit of collision geometry. This is going to be the object which is going to splash down into our fluid that is going to be contained within this container. We're viewing the container in a wireframe view, and we're calling this a mid-scale simulation. This container is 4 meters across on this side here, so a fairly big tank, but obviously it's not large scale, it's not an ocean, it's not a river, it's mid-scale. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a go at simulating a splash using all 3 of the X-Particles fluid solvers. We'll try it with XP Fluid Effects, with Fluid PBD, and with Fluid Flip, and you'll see that we can get a simulation with each, but we're going to get different results. So first of all, we'll have a look at XP Fluid Effects. So let's just have a look at our XP Fluid Effects system. We'll open that one out and we'll just activate it. So what we have in this system is a couple of things. First of all, we've got our collider geometry, which is our cube here. And that cube has got an X-Particles collider tag on it, and all of the bounce and friction's been taken off that collider tag. So that's that bit of collision geometry. And then we also have our tank. So with XP Fluid Effects and with XP Fluid PBD, if you want to contain fluid within a container, you have to make that container and put an X-Particles collider tag on. So this is our cube, and if we just have a look at this tank without this wireframe display, let's just switch off that display tag, you can see it's just a Cinema 4D parametric cube object. Let's put that wireframe back on, and we have an X-Particles collider tag with the normal set to inside because we want to trap that fluid on the inside. All right, pretty self-explanatory so far. So now let's have a look at our emitter. Well, here is our XP emitter. We've actually got 2 in our scene, but let's just ignore this foam emitter for now, and we've got that one switched off. So we've got our water tank emitter. Let's just go to display mode of that emitter, to the particles tab, and let's just hit the draw emitter option. And you can see, look, we have got this cuboid emitter shape, and if we go forward 1 frame, you can see that that is emitting particles. So let's just have a look at the emission mode of that emitter. And it's important with fluids to have your particles be emitted in a way where they are really well spaced. Evenly spaced particles is very important. And there are 2 emission modes that will ensure that. We have got hexagonal mode, which we have at the moment, and if we just dolly in, you'll see that these particles are arranged in an hexagonal grid formation. They are not intersecting, and that ensures that we get as many particles as possible within this volume in a way that is not intersecting and is very evenly spaced, which is important for all fluid solvers. There's also a regular mode, and that just means that it's a regular grid rather than an hexagonal grid, which works very well as well, but it just means that you are going to have fewer particles in a regular mode. Hexagonal mode manages to cram more particles in that same volume without them intersecting. So that is our basic fluid setup. So if we try and run this sim, let's just have a look down. We do have obviously a gravity modifier in our scene as well. And there's also a kill modifier in there. And that kill modifier is just to ensure that if any particles escape the bounds of our box due to low fluid simulation settings, then they'll just be killed off. So it'll be hidden from our view and killed and not calculated. So if we switch off our fluid solvers, look, we don't have any of them active, the foam or the XP fluid effects. So if we hit play now, what's going to happen is the particles are going to be emitted. They're immediately going to be brought down to the bottom of that container due to the gravity modifier, and they've all just collapsed on themselves. And because there's no modifiers affecting their movement, they've just all collapsed on themselves, and we have a very regular distribution of these particles resting on the bottom of that collision geometry. And that's because the particles don't care about the other particles. They're not interacting with each other in any way at all. They're all just individual entities, and they've fallen to the bottom and collided with the polygons of that tank. So if we go back to the beginning, activate fluid effects. Now the fluid solver is going to make those particles interact with their neighbours. And that interaction and the calculations that are made is going to create a fluid-like body of particles which are all influencing each other. So if we hit play, you're going to see the first thing is that the particles don't all drop to the bottom of the tank. If we just change the camera angle, they are maintaining their volume as a fluid should. And if we hit play, you're going to see that those particles are going to be interacting with this collision geometry as it moves down. So let's just hit pause there, and we can see we're already, look, getting some interaction here. It's creating this wave. And let's carry this on. And there we go. And so we can get an obvious fluid simulation is beginning to happen here. Now, we've almost got 200,000 particles, which we're trying to simulate in real time here. So obviously we haven't got very fast viewport performance. So let's just switch to a cached version of this scene. I'm just going to switch on our cache object here. And now we're going to be able to play through this much more quickly. And if we hit play, you'll see that as it splashes down, it obviously interacts with those particles. We create a splash, and we're getting some very obvious fluid-like motion from our XP Fluid Effects fluid solver. And that looks very nice. Now, what we're also able to do is add some foam particles, and you can see here in our dynamics menu, we have brought in an XP foam, which is a dynamic modifier. Now, we're not going to go through all of the settings of this now. We will go through that and explain exactly how it works in a further video within this series. But this is all in its default settings, and what XP foam does, it looks for the waves that are created in the fluid simulation, and it also looks at the air that could be trapped within that fluid simulation because of fast-moving particles relative to each other, trapping air in there, and it creates these foam and spray particles. So if we activate our cached foam emitter, let's put that on, hit play, and the foam brings all of the nice, precise detail to our fluid sims, and we can see these white particles are the generated foam particles, and it's starting to look really nice. So this is XP Fluid Effects in its default settings. It's on low accuracy, which means it's faster to simulate. And we're getting a nice simulation. We can see, look, this water is moving around, it's swirling, the foam is kind of accentuating that detail. And this is looking pretty nice for our mid-scale fluid sim. So XP Fluid Effects working very nicely. So let's just deactivate that system, because we also have another system, which is an XP Fluid PBD system. So let's just activate that one. Now, this is exactly the same setup. The only difference is that instead of the XP Fluid Effects solver, we have brought in an XP Fluid PBD solver. And this uses exactly the same tank with the same collision object. It uses exactly the same animated cube with the collider tag. The only difference is that we have brought in a Fluid PBD solver instead of the FX solver. And if we activate this cached PBD emitter and hit play, you'll see that we're getting a similar thing. If we pause it there, you can see that we're getting that volume retention of our water body. So the solver is doing as it should there. But you'll notice that we are getting a fluid solve. This is behaving like a fluid, but we have far less detail than we did with the fluid effects solve. And we're getting a nice kind of ripple here. And we can see these ripples moving through our water body. So it is solving this as a fluid body, but we're just not getting that nice detail that we were getting with the XP fluid effects solver. And this is just due to the way in which this fluid solve is calculated. And in a scene like this, at this scale, this mid-scale, XP fluid effects gives you more realistic water and nicer splash detail. XP Fluid PBD works with foam though, just like XP Fluid Effects does. So let's just cache this. This is the XP foam in its default settings. And you can see that we are getting that foam detail as this comes through. But because we're not getting as much kind of energy and detail in that water sim, obviously we're not getting as much foam as well. And we're getting a nice fluid sim, but it's just not as realistic or as pleasing as the XP Fluid Effects sim. So for that reason, we'd advise if you're doing kind of a mid-scale fluid sim, XP Fluid PBD isn't the best option for you. Let's just deactivate that system. And now we'll go on to our XP Fluid Flip system, which is the same simulation, the same setup, but XP Fluid Flip is slightly different because XP Fluid Flip must take place within a cuboid domain. So let's just visualize that, because at the moment the scene looks identical. But if we go to our XP Fluid Flip solver, which is going to be doing our fluid for us, and we go to the display tab, we can display our grid. Let's just look at the voxels first. And what we can see is this blue outline of our cuboid, and then we have got these cuboid voxels inside in this three-dimensional grid. So let's just put that to back, which will give us a 2D representation of that grid so we can see a bit more clearly. So with Fluid Flip, the fluid simulation has to take place within this domain. It only works within this domain, which can make it limiting depending on your scene. It also means that if we're simulating a splash tank like this, we don't need the tank geometry, so we can just deactivate that tank geometry, and the fluid will actually interact and be contained within the walls of this bounds. We don't need any collision geometry to contain that liquid. So there are other differences as well, and we'll explore those differences when we look at XP Fluid Flip individually in a following video. But that's the main difference. So let's just take that display away so we can have a look, and we'll bring the tank back in, but this is just a visual tank. This tank isn't doing any collision. Okay, so let's just deactivate our foam emitter. And what you can see with the XP Fluid Flip solve is that we're getting a very similar thing happening. We're keeping the volume of this fluid. It's starting to interact with our collision geometry. And look at that splash detail. So even more splash detail and movement than the XP Fluid Effects solve gave us. And if we carry on scrubbing through this, you can see we're getting some very nice wave detail. And also note that XP Fluid Flip is brilliant at maintaining the angular momentum of this water system, of these waves. And look at them as they hit against the sides and reflect and come back. And look, we've still got nice wave movement now, and then they crash into the middle, creating another splash. So XP Fluid Flip is giving us a wonderful mid-scale simulation here for our splash tank. It also works with our XP Foam dynamic modifier. So let's switch on that foam emitter as well, which we've cached. And now you're going to see, now we're bringing out the detail with the foam, you're going to see the strength of using XP Fluid Flip for this mid-scale scene. We're getting wonderful detail here, and you're going to be able to see this momentum of these waves maintained throughout the sim. Really nice reflections. And I mean, here we look at this detail at this point, it just looks fantastic. So in this scale, and with the simplicity of the bounds of this simulation, XP Fluid Flip is the clear winner. So let's just do a bit of a comparison here of these three solvers solving the same scene, and we can compare what they look like. So if we bring up our picture viewer, so you can see on the left we've got the Fluid Flip, on the middle we've got the Fluid Effects, on the right we've got the Fluid PBD. Now all of these solves are pretty much in their default settings, and they took around 4 minutes to cache all of these scenes each. So let's just hit play. And when we do these side by side, you can really see the difference in detail. The XP Fluid Flip obviously is giving us the nicest sim with all of those fantastic kind of reflections, and the foam is being generated, the crests of those waves. And it's looking really nice. Fluid Effects is giving us a nice sim. We're getting a decent splash, we're getting foam, and we're getting a bit of nice kind of continued movement here, but nowhere near the detail of the Fluid Flip. And you can see the Fluid PBD, although is solving like a fluid, it's giving us the less pleasing simulation of the three. So if we go back to our scene, let's just explore one thing though, because we have seen from this scene that XP Fluid Flip is the nicest solve. But actually, XP Fluid Effects can be made better. Now, what XP Fluid Effects has as a difference to PBD and Fluid Flip is that if you increase the simulation accuracy of specifically fluid effects, you get nicer and more realistic water movement. It also makes it a more stable simulation, and it makes it technically more accurate, which is something that we're going to explore in later videos. But Fluid Effects also gets better water movement the more accurate you make the simulation. And that isn't necessarily the case with PBD and Fluid Flip. So let's just go into another scene. And in this scene, what we have done is exactly the same setup, but in our XP Fluid Effects solver object, we have increased the accuracy of the simulation, and we've put it was on fast, which is the default, which took 4 minutes to simulate, and we've changed it to high. And the result is it took 20 minutes to simulate, so a lot longer. But you will see that on these high settings, we have got a much bigger splash, and we're going to have more retention of that water movement and more detail within the sim. So XP Fluid Effects can get a better water sim by increasing the solver accuracy at the cost of it taking longer to simulate. Let's now do a side-by-side of Fluid Flip in its default settings and Fluid Effects in these higher simulation settings. So we have Fluid Effects on the right here. Now remember, Fluid Effects in these conditions took over 20 minutes to simulate, whereas Fluid Flip in this default was only 4. Let's hit play. So you can see we have got a nicer Fluid Effects sim by increasing that accuracy. We've got more foam, we've got a bigger splash at the beginning, but even then, we still haven't got this very nice detail that XP Fluid Flip is giving us in its default settings. So for this scene, we have a clear winner. We would go with XP Fluid Flip because we're getting a much nicer simulation than we are with XP Fluid Effects. And for this instance, and this mid-scale scene, XP Fluid Flip would be the solver to choose. In this scene, we want to simulate water cascading down this nice rock face. It's about 10 meters, so it's a fairly big large-scale scene, this. And after looking at our previous scene, you would be forgiven in thinking, well, obviously we need to go for XP Fluid Flip as our fluid solver here, because it's a mid to large scale scene, and Flip is going to give us that really nice extra bit of kind of movement and detail. But actually, if you have a look in our object manager, you can see that we are actually using an XP Fluid Effects solver. This scene is cached. Let's have a look at what we've got. So you can see our water cascading down. It's creating some nice foam. It's cutting off here. That's because we've actually got a kill modifier in there, just so we haven't got lots of particles. We're confining it to this area here, which keeps it more efficient. Obviously, if your camera angle required you to see this area, our kill modifier would need to be adapted. Let's just make that invisible for now. And as you can see, we're getting a nice simulation here. We're getting this water cascading down. We're getting all of that detail from the XP Foam dynamic modifier, and this is looking pretty nice. You can also see that we're using an additional dynamic modifier here, the XP Sheeter, and we'll go into more detail and look into exactly what that is doing within this scene in a moment. But before we do, let's explore why we have decided to use XP Fluid Effects as our fluid solver in this scene rather than XP Fluid Flip. And it's all to do with our collisions. So let's just switch that cache off, go back to the first frame, and we'll just temporarily, let's deactivate our sheeter and our XP Foam. So what we have here, if we have a look at the scene, is our collision geometry is actually just a plane. It's a plane that has been sculpted somewhat. Let's have a look in our object manager. And it's further displaced by this displacer deformer. So we can see here is our plane, which has been sculpted to have these nice kind of plateau sections, and then it's given that bit of kind of bumpy detail with the displacer deformer, and there we have our geometry, and that's giving us this nice appearance of a rock face. And you may have been given this as an asset from a different artist and say, right, we need some fluid simulated down this rock face, please. And this is the reason why we have picked XP Fluid Effects, because collisions with the XP Fluid Effects solver are just the usual X-Particles polygon collision system. So if we have a look, our geometry cliff object has got an X-Particles collider tag on it. We've got everything set to 0 apart from 1% friction, and our normals are set to outside, so the particles will react with the outside faces of this plane. And if we go to our draw bounds, we can actually see how the active collisions are working. X-Particles polygon collisions, it works in a kind of smart, adaptive way, so it only gives it the great detail of calculation where it is necessary. So this area, where there aren't any particles, it isn't dividing this up to work out accurate collisions, and so we're not wasting computational power. And as we play through the sim, you can see, look at the adaptive collision system working, and we're getting perfect collisions. Let's just switch off those draw bounds. We're getting perfect collisions, no leaking, and that's working really well. It's incredibly robust. However, the XP Fluid Flip solver works differently in how it calculates its collisions, and because it works differently, the way it does it isn't suited to this scene. So to explore that, let's just jump back to our previous scene. So we'll go back to our splash tank. So here we have our splash tank scene, and what we're able to do, we're looking at let's just deactivate the fluid effects and let's look at the flip version of this scene. And what we'll do is we'll switch off our cache. Let's switch off the foam, we don't need that. And what we want to do is view how Flip is working out the collisions of our animated cuboid here. So the way in which we'll do that, if we go forward a frame, you can see we've got our particles and our object is going to splash into them. But we can visualize how Flip is working out these collisions by going to the XP Fluid Flip solver, going to the display tab, and we can display the colliders. So let's do that. We'll click on that. And can you see, look, we have these red squares now. If we dolly in a bit, we have a red square, and we have one red square per fluid flip voxel wherever this object is within those bounds. So let's just make the collider invisible. And there we can see the collision system. And what's happening is the voxels are sampling the particles' position, but they're also sampling the position of our collision geometry. And as we play through, you will see that, look, as that cuboid is animating, it is sampling its position within those within the voxel grid, and it's creating this collision. And then it's these sampled collisions which are then influencing how the particles move. And the problem with doing this is that it's a little bit like a digital photo. The higher the resolution, the more accurate that digital photo is. If you go really low in a digital photograph pixels resolution, there'll be very little detail. It'll be all pixelated. And you can see that, look, we're getting almost an aliased sampling as this collision geometry has been put at this angle. So for this reason, the collisions aren't as accurate as they would be in XP fluid effects, especially if you've got a complex bit of collision geometry with lots of kind of curved surfaces, because it's going to struggle to be able to sample that detail unless you put the fluid flip on very high resolution, tiny voxel sizes, and that has knock-on effects for other parts of the simulation. The other symptom of this is that it cannot sample geometry that has no depth, like a plane. So for example, if we bring in a plane primitive, and let's just take that plane primitive and we'll move it up a little bit, and we'll put an X-Particles collider tag on it. So now it's in the middle of our grid. Let's just make it invisible, but we know it's there. If we hit play, it isn't able to sample that plane. So it's as if it isn't there. So that is the reason why, if we go back to our waterfall scene, we are not able to use the XP fluid flip here, because our geometry that we have inherited from our other artists has no depth, and so it wouldn't be able to sample this as collision geometry. If you wanted to use XP fluid flip for a scene like this, you would have to remodel this rock face in a way which meant it was geometry that had this as one of its faces, but it also had some depth, and then it could be sampled by the collision system within XP fluid flip, and it could be used. Another reason why XP fluid flip is not necessarily the best for this scene, even if we had some collision geometry that would work, is the way in which it calculates the scene within the bounds. And to demonstrate that, let's just bring in an XP fluid flip domain. So XP fluid flip, and here it is. So obviously we would need to reposition this and resize this to ensure that the area and the volume in which we wanted to simulate was within the bounds of our cuboid, our domain. And then we would hit play and we would get an adaptive bounds where it would only try and solve these voxels where there was action happening. But the problem is that adaptive bounds is a cuboid shape as well. So we'd effectively be solving all of these voxels where we have fluid, but because it'd be taking place within the adaptive bounds cuboid, we would be solving all of these empty voxels as well in 3 dimensions. And so it quickly becomes a very inefficient way of solving this fluid. It is possible, it would work with the correct collision geometry, but it would take an awful lot longer and it'd be more inefficient. And so for that reason, fluid effects may be the more obvious choice for solving this scene. So now we've established that we would use XP fluid effects for this scene. Let's have a look at some of the other dynamic modifiers that we're using to get the look which we require. So if we hit play, you can see that we've got our fluid coming out of our emitter, and it's cascading down this this rock face. But it's not looking particularly fluid-like until we get it pooling in these areas. What we really need is more water particles. So if we go to our emitter, let's go to our emission tab. We're emitting these particles in an hexagonal grid. So if we want more particles, we need to reduce the radius so more particles can fit within the same area of the emitter. So if we put this down to, say, 0.5, now we're going to have loads more particles, but still it doesn't look like we've got many more particles because they're kind of just pooling together. We're not getting a spread of these particles. So what we're going to do is use a dynamic modifier which will analyze the particles within this water sim, and depending on some of the settings that we put, it's going to fill in some of these gaps with extra fluid particles. And that is what the XP Sheeter dynamic modifier does. So let's go back to our emitter, and let's just put that back down to the radius of 1. So again, we've got fewer particles in the scene, and we've got this look, which is fine, but it's not quite what we want. So now we're going to be able to fill in some of these gaps by activating our XP Sheeter. Now, we're not going to go into what all of these settings do in this video. We'll explore these in more depth in a separate video to follow. But effectively what it does, it looks at these particles in the scene, and if they are moving away from each other in a way that satisfies all of these various thresholds that we set for density, distance, speed, and angle of movement, it will then fill all of those particles in. So just with that XP Sheeter active, it doesn't need an extra emitter or anything like that. If we hit play, you will see that straight away, look, it's creating and filling in these gaps with our Sheeter particles, and straight away we're getting a much more pleasing fluid simulation. So let's just make an adjustment to one of these settings, and this is the angle at which the particles are moving away from each other. If we reduce this, it will only sheet particles which are moving at an angle away from each other 9 degrees or less. And if we hit play, now we're going to have less broad sheeting. It'll be filling in these gaps a little. So we are getting some, but it's not as pronounced. So we're getting lots of thin, almost tendrils of fluid which are being filled in. If we increase that angle, more particles will be considered for sheeting. And now we're going to get much broader sheets. Look, all of this has now been filled in with our fluid particles, and I would say for our simulation this is too much, but this is simulating a far bigger kind of body of water, lots more water pouring down, cascading its way down, and we're getting these really broad sheets of filled in water particles. Now for us, we could say that that is too much. Let's put this down to, say, 15. And of course, when we're doing this for real, we can make these small adjustments to all of these various different threshold sliders to get exactly that sheeting look that we require. And then once we've got our sheeter settings sorted and we're happy with the look, we can of course use the XP foam dynamic modifier, which we used in the previous scene. This does require its own emitter, and this will produce those foam and spray detailed particles depending on the various different parameters that you set. So let's hit play. In fact, we'll activate our cache here. So we've cached at those settings, and now you can see, look, we're getting this fantastic cascading of particles. We're sheeting to fill in those gaps, and we're getting the detail from our foam particles. So in this instance, fluid effects was the solver to go for, partly because of the geometry that we have inherited from this. It's flat geometry with no depth, which means it's no good for XP fluid flip. But even if we had decent geometry which had depth for fluid flip may take a long time to simulate because of the way in which the scene is set up. The adaptive bound system means it's going to have to be sampling an awful lot of voxels which actually aren't doing anything. So for this instance, XP Fluid Effects was the appropriate choice for this sim.